The story unfolding tonight is unlike anything Britain has seen in generations. This is not a simple election win. This is not a quiet transfer of power from one worn-out government to another. What we are living through is a political earthquake that has smashed through the foundations of the establishment. Nigel Farage, the man they laughed at, mocked, banned and dismissed as a protest politician, now stands as the most powerful Prime Minister in modern British history. Reform UK has risen from the shadows and delivered what once seemed impossible, a 74-seat majority that has blown Labour to pieces, humiliated the Conservatives and sent shockwaves rattling from number 10 to Buckingham Palace. Tonight, Britain is not just changing leaders, it is rewriting its destiny. The numbers are staggering, almost unbelievable. 362 seats in Parliament. Let that sink in. Not a projection, not an opinion poll, but reality carved into the electoral map. Labour, the party that once claimed to represent the working class, has been stripped bare. Their so-called red wall collapsed brick by brick, leaving Rachel Reeves, Angela Rayner and Ed Miliband politically finished. The regions Labour once called their empire, South Wales, the Midlands, the North East, have fallen into Reform's turquoise wave. The betrayal of Brexit, the obsession with identity politics, the endless sneering at ordinary people finally came back to destroy them. And what remains of Labour now is nothing but rubble, a broken skeleton of its former self. But if Labour's collapse is shocking, the fate of the Conservatives is catastrophic. A party that once boasted the legacies of Churchill, Thatcher and Johnson has been reduced to just 22 seats. 22! The party that dominated British politics for over a century has been annihilated. Rishi Sunak is finished, his career reduced to dust. Kemi Badenoch, once paraded as the future of the Tories, is already the leader of nothing. Suella Braverman, the so-called lioness of the right, couldn't even defend her own seat. The blue wall, once the symbol of Tory strength, has shattered into pieces. Tonight, the Tory party has not just been defeated, it has been erased. And yet this story is not just about Farage's numbers. It is about power, real power. For decades, ordinary people were ignored, mocked and dismissed as irrelevant. Builders, farmers, nurses, soldiers, shopkeepers, people who were told their voices didn't matter, have risen up to flip the system upside down. These are not polished career politicians trained in Oxbridge debating clubs. They are ordinary men and women who now hold extraordinary power. And that is what terrifies Westminster more than anything else. The champagne glasses of the elite have been knocked from their hands. The BBC cannot spin it. Brussels cannot contain it. Washington cannot ignore it. Britain has spoken and its voice is so loud it is shaking the walls of Buckingham Palace. That is why tonight the streets outside the palace are filled with furious energy. Protesters, voters, supporters, ordinary people are demanding to be heard. They are chanting Farage's name, waving Reform UK banners and calling for a government that finally represents them. The monarchy, long considered untouchable, now finds itself staring at a movement too powerful to ignore. Inside palace walls, whispers have already begun. Can the king intervene? Can the Crown act? Can anything stop this surge? But with a 74-seat majority, the brutal truth is clear. Nothing can stop Nigel Farage now. The old order has collapsed. The new order has begun. And behind the closed doors of Whitehall, panic is spreading fast. Civil servants who spent years serving Labour and Tory ministers are staring at an army of Reform MPs they do not know, cannot control and cannot predict. These new MPs owe nothing to the establishment. They owe everything to the people. They will not be bribed, silenced or manipulated. They are unpolished but unbending, and that is exactly why the elites are terrified. Britain has never seen a parliament like this. The debates will not be polite theatre for television cameras. They will be raw, unfiltered and uncompromising. For the first time in decades, the voices of forgotten Britain will roar across the chamber of the House of Commons. Tonight, the old political map is gone. The red wall is rubble. The blue wall is dust. The entire system has been redrawn in turquoise. Reform UK is no longer a protest party, it is the ruling party, and Nigel Farage, the man they called a clown, is now the most powerful Prime Minister since Churchill. What happens next will not just change Britain, it will shake the entire world. Because this victory is not only about Britain's future, it is about the death of globalism's grip on the nation and the rebirth of a Britain that believes in itself once again. The chaos outside this palace was only the beginning. Across Britain, the shockwaves of Reform UK's majority were tearing through every institution, every stronghold of the old order. In London, Whitehall officials were scrambling, their carefully written reports suddenly worthless. The BC, once so confident in their predictions, was left stammering as the results rolled in, each new number more devastating than the last. Labour MPs, who had spent decades cementing their grip on power, now found themselves humiliated, their so-called red wall reduced to rubble. And the Conservatives, the party that once claimed to be the natural rulers of Britain, were left shattered, holding fewer seats than at any point in living memory. Commentators called it a political earthquake, but the truth was even deeper. This wasn't just a shift in power, it was the destruction of the old system. The tearing down of a rotten house that had stood for too long. What made the night even more shocking was how quickly the momentum had turned. Just hours before the polls closed, Labour leaders were still whispering of a hung parliament, of another fragile coalition, of politics as usual. But the people had other plans. Town after town, city after city, Reform's turquoise wave surged forward, sweeping aside complacent incumbents with the fury of a nation betrayed. In Sunderland, results came in showing Labour heartlands collapsing. In Cornwall, the Tories were obliterated by margins they could never have imagined. Even in Scotland, where nationalist dominance had seemed untouchable, voters broke ranks, turning to Farage as if he were the only figure left who dared to defy the establishment. This wasn't a protest vote, it was an uprising. Ordinary Britons, long silenced and dismissed, had risen at the ballot box with the force of a storm, and now they were demanding to be heard. And while the victors celebrated, the corridors of power were drowning in panic. Rumours spread that senior Labour figures were preparing leadership challenges before dawn, desperate to distance themselves from the humiliation. Tory grandees sat in darkened rooms, speaking in hushed tones about the death of their party, the betrayal of their voters, and the years of decline that had led to this reckoning. Commentators speculated openly about a complete realignment of British politics, a rewriting of the rules that had governed Westminster for more than a century. Some whispered that Britain now stood on the brink of revolution, not through violence, but through the most powerful weapon of all, democracy. But as the turquoise tide swept over the land, one question lingered in the air like a storm cloud. What comes next? Because this victory, as staggering as it was, would not be simple. Reform UK had promised change. Radical, sweeping, unstoppable change. But change comes with enemies. In Brussels, EU officials were reportedly horrified, already plotting how to respond to a Britain they no longer understood. In Washington, diplomats scrambled to contact Farage's inner circle, uncertain of what the new Prime Minister would demand or refuse. And at home, powerful unions, media barons and financial elites braced themselves for a fight. For decades, they had dictated the rhythm of British politics. Now, for the first time, they were facing a government that owed them nothing, that did not fear their influence, that was willing to tear apart the structures they had so carefully built. Britain had chosen its new masters, and the old masters would not go quietly. The night belonged to Farage, but the morning would belong to the struggle ahead. As dawn approached, thousands still filled the streets, chanting, waving turquoise flags and demanding the promises be kept. They had stormed the palace gates not for spectacle, but for justice. For years, they had endured betrayal after betrayal, watching their towns decline, their traditions mocked, their voices silenced. Now, with 362 seats in Parliament, they finally believed change was coming. But history has shown that revolutions are never clean and victories are never final. Even as the turquoise banners flew above Westminster, the forces of resistance were regrouping in the shadows, ready to strike back. And so the story of Britain's greatest political earthquake had only just begun. The fallout was instant, brutal and unstoppable. Across Westminster, the once mighty Labour and Conservative parties now looked like shattered relics of a bygone age. For Labour, it was nothing short of humiliation. Keir Starmer, who only months ago was being hailed as the man who would guide Britain back into stability, was now left speechless. The results were undeniable. His promises of integrity and reform had collapsed under the sheer weight of public fury. The very voters who had once trusted him turned their backs, declaring in one thunderous voice that the old politics was finished. Labour's red wall reduced to rubble. Safe seats that had been passed down like family heirlooms, snatched away overnight, painted in Reform UK's bold turquoise. For the Tories, the devastation was even darker. The party of Churchill, Thatcher and May was left gasping for air, their identity fractured, their power base obliterated. The humiliation was so severe that whispers began to rise. Was this the end of the Conservative Party itself? Could it even survive such a defeat? Some MPs fled the count halls in tears. Others faced furious constituents demanding to know why they had ignored the warnings of Brexit betrayal, immigration failures, and endless scandals. What had once been a proud two-party system had collapsed right before Britain's eyes. And yet, in the midst of the carnage, Nigel Farage stood firm, his turquoise wave sweeping across the nation. His speech that night was not just a victory lap, it was a declaration of war against the entire political establishment. He mocked the crumbling leaders of the old order, declaring that Britain was finally free from the parasites of the past. His words were sharp, almost prophetic, as though he were cutting the cords that tied the country to its history of broken promises. For many voters, this was not just politics, it was revenge. For years, they had been ignored, dismissed, mocked. Now their voices thundered through Parliament, with 74 new Reform MPs standing shoulder to shoulder, ready to burn the old system to ashes. The anger of the people had finally found its weapon, and that weapon wore turquoise. But this victory carried with it an edge of fear. The political establishment was not going to let go of power so easily. Behind closed doors, Labour strategists whispered about legal challenges, desperate to claw back what had been lost. The Conservatives plotted in silence, determined to rebuild their broken empire. The elites, the bankers, the civil service mandarins, they were all watching Farage with suspicion, ready to undermine him at the first mistake. Britain was no longer simply divided, it was standing on the edge of a deeper confrontation. Was Reform UK truly strong enough to govern, or would the machinery of the state crush them before they even began? Even inside Reform, the cracks were already starting to show. The sudden surge of new MPs brought chaos and uncertainty. Many were inexperienced, propelled into power not because of polished politics, but because of the people's desperation. Could they survive the ruthless game of Westminster? Or would the establishment pick them off one by one? This was no longer just about an election. This was about survival. Britain had chosen its earthquake, but the aftershocks were only just beginning. And as the nation trembled in the wake of this stunning revolt, one terrifying question hung in the air: was this the rebirth of British democracy, or the first step toward its destruction? The streets of London burned with noise, fury and celebration. Reform UK banners were being waved outside Parliament, while in the palace itself security had locked down every entrance. But inside those walls, a storm unlike any Britain had seen in generations was erupting. Labour MPs were shouting across the chamber, their voices cracking with anger and disbelief. Tory veterans sat frozen in their seats, unable to comprehend how their centuries-old dominance had evaporated overnight. Nigel Farage stood tall, his face marked with exhaustion, but also with the undeniable glow of victory. He had promised a political revolution, and now it was here, louder, sharper, and more unstoppable than anyone had ever imagined. Britain's political DNA had been rewritten in a single night, and there was no going back. But while the public celebrated, the cracks within the establishment widened. Secret conversations were taking place behind closed doors. Civil servants were quietly raising the alarm, warning that the machinery of government was not ready for such a radical upheaval. Old alliances were breaking apart, while new power brokers were being born. Rumours spread that members of the House of Lords were preparing to resist sweeping reforms Farage had promised. igniting whispers of a constitutional clash at the very heart of Britain's democracy. Could the unelected peers of the upper chamber stand in the way of a government chosen by millions? And if they tried, would the people outside the gates of Westminster accept it, or would they storm those gates as they stormed the palace only hours ago? The markets trembled with uncertainty as global investors tried to calculate what this turquoise wave meant for Britain's future. Would Farage pull the UK further from the EU than ever before, or would he strike secret deals behind closed doors? America, Brussels, and even Moscow were watching closely. The world's most powerful leaders had underestimated him, but they could not ignore him now. Reform UK had not just won an election, it had shaken the geopolitical balance, and Nigel Farage, once mocked as a sideshow, now stood as the most important man in Britain, with a mandate stronger than any prime minister in decades. The old order was collapsing, but what would rise from the ashes was still uncertain, and uncertainty breeds chaos. And then came the most shocking whispers of all, that this wasn't just about politics anymore. Some claimed the king himself had been briefed on emergency measures should Farage's reforms spiral out of control. Others suggested MI5 and MI6 were deeply divided, unsure whether this new government would strengthen Britain or weaken it beyond repair. Every institution of power, from the palace to the intelligence services, was rattled. The question hanging in the air was chilling. Did Britain truly stand at the dawn of a new golden age, or on the edge of a constitutional collapse that could tear the nation apart? The palace gates are no longer just symbols of power. They have become the front line of a storm Britain has never seen before. The political earthquake triggered by Nigel Farage's Reform UK victory has not only shattered the foundations of Parliament, but has now spilled into the very heart of the nation. As voters flood the streets, their anger boiling over, the old guard stumbles in disbelief, unable to grasp how completely the balance of power has shifted overnight. For decades, politics in Britain was a battle between Labour and the Conservatives, a cycle of red and blue. Now the turquoise wave has smashed both into ruins, leaving millions questioning what comes next. Reform UK holds a 74-seat majority, and Nigel Farage stands as the Prime Minister many thought impossible. But with his rise comes fear, uncertainty, and whispers of civil disorder that the government can no longer ignore. This is not just a political story, it is a national reckoning. Labour is in free fall, the Tories are humiliated, and voters who once felt ignored have found a new voice. But that voice is loud, divided and uncontrollable. Crowds gathering at the palace demand change faster than any government can deliver. Some chant Farage's name like a saviour, others accuse him of hijacking democracy. Britain's streets echo with fury and hope, clashing together in a chaos that feels less like celebration and more like revolution. Reports from across the country speak of scuffles, protests, and Parliament Square drowned in turquoise banners. No politician, not even Farage, can fully command what has been unleashed. Behind closed doors, the establishment trembles. The monarchy, though silent, faces at one of its most uncomfortable moments since the abdication crisis of 1936. For centuries, the crown stood above politics, untouchable. But now, with voters at the gates, some daring to cry for the king to intervene, the unthinkable lingers. Could the monarchy be dragged into this storm? Could the king be forced to step into a battle that has already destroyed political giants? The answer may define Britain's future more than any election result. Meanwhile, Farage is walking a razor's edge. His campaign promised to restore Britain's pride, to cut ties with the old order, to stand up for the people. But already the weight of power presses down. The economy trembles and under global shock. European leaders watch nervously, and Washington whispers doubts about Britain's stability. Every speech, every decision, every stumble could turn supporters into enemies. He has broken the old political machine, but now he must prove he can build something from the wreckage. And yet in the air, there is something undeniable: excitement, terror, the sense of standing at the edge of history. Britain is no longer the same country it was yesterday. The turquoise revolution has begun and nothing will ever be the same again. The only question is whether this storm leads to renewal or to collapse. The voters have stormed the palace, the establishment has been broken and the world is watching. Britain has entered a new age and the story has only just begun.